Hello, future fifth graders, and welcome to today's Comparing Fractions lesson. We are going to talk about comparing fractions using benchmarks. A benchmark is a guide that helps you figure out the size of fractions you want to compare. The most common benchmarks used to compare fractions are 0, 1/2, and 1. The benchmark that we will be focusing on today is 1/2. Let's begin our lesson on comparing like fractions with a review of a few vocabulary words related to the study of fractions. First, what is a fraction? A fraction is a number that names part of a whole object or part of a group of objects. A fraction has two parts, a numerator and a denominator. The denominator of a fraction tells us the total number of equal parts in the whole object, or in a group of objects. It is the number on the bottom of a fraction. The denominator in 3/4 is 4 and tells us that 3/4 has 4 total parts. The way I remember which number is the denominator is to say denominator down, because it is found down on the bottom of the fraction. The numerator of a fraction tells us how many parts are being counted or shaded. It is the number on the top of a fraction. In 3/4, the numerator is 3. It tells us that 3/4 has 3 parts being counted or shaded. When we compare fractions, we decide whether two fractions are equal to each other or whether one is greater than another. To record that in a number sentence, we use the comparison symbols for greater than, less than, and equal to. When you record a comparison between two fractions in a number sentence, it is important to read it from left to right as if you were reading a sentence. It is also important to know how to read the symbols correctly and how to record them correctly. So let's review the symbols. When you use the greater than symbol, it opens to the left in your number sentence. When you use the less than symbol, it opens to the right. The equal sign is written as two marks, one on top of the other. Some of you may remember the alligator, who always eats the larger amount in a comparison number sentence. That means the alligator is going to eat the bigger shaded pieces in a fraction comparison. The alligator always wants the bigger shaded pieces.
Benchmark fractions. You learned before how to compare two fractions with equal denominators, such as 3/4 and 2/4. In this case, the fraction with the larger numerator is the greater fraction. So 3/4 is greater than 2/4. And if we have two fractions with equal numerators, such as 1/4 and 1/3, then the larger fraction is the fraction with the smaller denominator. So in this case, 1/3 is greater than 1/4. What about the case where two fractions have different numerators and denominators? How can we compare such fractions? As an example, let's try to compare the two fractions, 4/7 and 7/16. The denominators and numerators are different. How do we compare these fractions? Well, we can try to compare them to a third fraction that is easy to deal with. Here is one way to do it. First, let's look at the fraction 4/7. Notice that in 4/7, the whole consists of 7 equal parts, and we have 4 of those parts. Now, compare this fraction with 1/2. Is it larger than 1/2? Yes, 4/7 is larger than 1/2. You can see that visually by looking at the shaded area in the circle representing the fraction 4/7, and you can see it represents more than half of the circle. Another way to check that is by multiplying both the numerator and the denominator of the fraction 1/2 by 4 to get 4/8, which is the same as 1/2. As you remember, 1/2 and 4/8 represent the same portion of the whole. And, as we learned earlier, since the fraction 4/7 and 4/8 have the same numerator, the greater fraction is the one with the smaller denominator. So, 4/7 is greater than 4/8. And because 1/2 is equivalent to 4/8, 4/7 is also greater than 1/2. Now, what about the fraction 7/16? Let us try to do the same thing. The fraction 7/16 represents 7 parts out of the same whole, but that consists of 16 parts this time. So, is it larger than 1/2? Again, one way to find out is by looking at the shaded area representing the fraction 7/16. As you can see, it is less than 1/2. Another way to see this is to remember that 1/2 is equal to 8/16, which we get by multiplying both the numerator and the denominator by 8. And since both 7/16 and 8/16 have the same denominator, the greater fraction is the one with the larger numerator. So 8/16 is greater than 7/16. Since the fraction 1/2 is equivalent to 8/16, 1/2 is also greater than 7/16. Now that we know how our two fractions are compared to 1/2, we can say how they are compared to each other. You know how this works with whole numbers. For example, if you have the numbers 1, 2, and 3, you know that 3 is not just bigger than 2, it is also bigger than 1. And 1 is not just less than 2, it is also less than 3. We can order our fractions the same way we order whole numbers. So, we found out that 4/7 is greater than 1/2. You can write 4/7 followed by 1/2. And what about 7/16? We found out that 1/2 is greater than 7/16. It seems that 7/16 is the smallest fraction here. So you can put 7/16 after 1/2 in the set. This is our final order. We start with 4/7, then 1/2, then 7/16. So now it is easy to see which fraction is greater, 7/16 or 4/7. Just look at the order. 4/7 is the greater fraction. Fractions that are common and easy to deal with, such as 1/2, 1/4, or 1/3, are called benchmark fractions. And here, when we compared our original fractions, we used the benchmark fraction 1/2, which is very familiar. Then we compared the two fractions to this benchmark, and this helped us figure out which one was the greater fraction. So benchmark fractions work as reference points that provide a way to evaluate and compare other fractions. In this lesson, you learned how to compare fractions with different numerators and denominators using the benchmark fraction 1/2.
Now we will use fraction strips and the benchmark 1/2 to begin to compare 3/8 and 9/12. Look at the two fraction strips. It is obvious that 3/8 has less shaded than 9/12, so 3/8 is less than 9/12. The problem with just using the model is, do you want to go through life drawing pictures every time you have to compare fractions? Of course not. Fortunately, to compare fractions, we can use the benchmark 1/2 along with the fraction strip models to compare these two fractions. To use the benchmark 1/2, we first need to figure out how close the fractions are to 1/2 by using the models. Then we can compare the two fractions based on how close each fraction is to 1/2. So let's begin using our benchmark strategy for 1/2. The first step is to find 1/2 on each fraction strip and mark it. Let's mark half of the fraction strip for 3/8 first. Since that strip has 8 total pieces, I will mark 1/2 of 8/8. So you can see that I marked the halfway point on the strip with 3/8 shaded. Now we need to mark half of the fraction strip for 9/12. Since that strip has 12 total pieces, I will mark 1/2 of 12/12. Now you can see that I just marked the halfway point on the strip with 9/12 shaded. Now both strips show 1/2 shaded in the middle of both fraction strips. To use 1/2 as a guide to compare 3/8 and 9/12, we need to see how close each fraction is to 1/2 of the fraction strip models. Let's start with 3/8. Looking at the model for 3/8, you can see that 3/8 is less than 1/2 of the whole model. Looking at the fraction strip on the top and the blue number sentence, you can also see that 1/2 equals 4/8. Notice that the blue shading for 3/8 is only one part away from 1/2 or 4/8. The fraction strip and the benchmark 1/2 prove that the blue section for 3/8 is less than 1/2 of the whole model. Now let's look at the fraction strip for 9/12 to see how close it is to 1/2. Looking at the model for 9/12, you can see that 9/12 is greater than 1/2 of the whole model. Looking at the fraction strip on the bottom and the yellow number sentence, you can also see that 1/2 equals 6/12. Notice that the yellow shading for 9/12 is 3 parts past 1/2, or 6/12. The fraction strip and the benchmark 1/2 prove that the yellow section for 9/12 is greater than 1/2 of the whole model. Look at the number sentences in white under the bars. They show the comparison of 3/8, 1/2, and 9/12. We know from the fraction strips that 3/8 is less than 1/2 and 9/12 is greater than 1/2. If 3/8 is less than 1/2 and 9/12 is greater than 1/2, that means 3/8 is also less than 9/12. Another way to compare those same two fractions, 3/8 and 9/12, using the benchmark 1/2, is to place the fractions on a number line, which is what we have here. The first number line shows a blue 3/8 with a dot and 1/2 in blue. The second number line shows a yellow 9/12 with a yellow dot and 1/2 in yellow. You can easily see that the blue 3/8 is less than 1/2 and the yellow 9/12 is greater than 1/2. We can see that 3/8 is less than 1/2 and that 9/12 is greater than 1/2. So again, 3/8 has to be less than 9/12. This number line shows the same information as the last one. This one is a little easier to read. That's because the 3/8, 1/2, and 9/12 are all on the same number line this time. If you look at the number line and the number sentences in the white boxes, once again we see if 3/8 is less than 1/2 and 9/12 is greater than 1/2, then 3/8 is less than 9/12. Let's use 1/2 as a benchmark and a number line to compare two more fractions, 4/5 and 3/10. Notice the first number line has a yellow 1/2 in the middle and a yellow dot for a yellow 4/5. Notice also that we can see that 4/5 is located to the right of 1/2. So 4/5 is greater than 1/2. Look at the second number line. It has a blue 1/2 in the middle and a blue dot for a blue 3/10. Notice also that we can see that 3/10 is located to the left of 1/2. So 3/10 is less than 1/2. Let's look at the two white boxes and review what we just found out. The first box says that 4/5 is greater than 1/2, and the other box says that 3/10 is less than 1/2. So 4/5 must be greater than 3/10. This number line shows the same information as the last one. This one is a little easier to read. That's because the 3/10, 1/2, and 4/5 are all on the same number line this time. If you look at the number line and the number sentences in the white boxes, once again we see if 3/10 is less than 1/2 and 4/5 is greater than 1/2, then 3/10 is less than 4/5. Let's try some together. Use 1/2 as a benchmark and compare the two fractions. Remember to decide if the fractions are greater than 1/2 or less than 1/2. Then decide which fraction is larger based on the benchmark. Fill in the circle for the equation in your journal or on your notebook paper. Use the symbols less than, greater than, or equal to fill in the circle. Draw a model for each fraction to help you. Let's check. When we put 3/8 on the number line, we can see that it is less than 1/2. When we put 11/16 on the number line, we can see that it is greater than 1/2. So if 3/8 is less than 1/2 and 11/16 is greater than 1/2, then 3/8 is less than 11/16. Let's do another. Use 1/2 as a benchmark and compare the fractions. Remember to decide if the fractions are greater than 1/2 or less than 1/2. Then decide which fraction is larger based on the benchmark. Fill in the circle for the equation in your journal or on your notebook paper. Use the symbols less than, greater than, or equal to fill in the circle. Draw a model for each fraction to help you. Let's check. When we put 4/18 on the number line, we can see that it is less than 1/2. When we put 9/10 on the number line, we can see that it is greater than 1/2. So if 4/18 is less than 1/2 and 9/10 is greater than 1/2, then 4/18 is less than 9/10. Try it on your own. Read the word problem. Write and solve the word problem in your journal or on your notebook paper. Fill in the circles in the equations below using the symbols less than, greater than, or equal to. Write the answer in a complete sentence. Emma and Tyler went on a hike. Emma walked 9/10 of the trail before stopping to rest. Tyler walked 5/12 of the trail before stopping to rest. Which student walked farther before stopping to rest? A rhyme to remember how to use benchmarks to compare fractions. When comparing or ordering two different fractions, let a benchmark be your guiding action. Just begin by putting the fractions in a rectangle or on a number line and choose the benchmark to compare. It'll be fine. Keep practicing. Can we help you? Logging off.